The Galactic Conqueror's Wrath. The Great Hall of Queen Velkera was a place where empires crumbled, where the strongest warriors of the galaxy knelt before her, trembling in fear. The throne room was massive, built from the remains of conquered worlds. Alien warlords, generals, and nobles gathered, watching with cruel amusement as the latest batch of human prisoners was brought in. Earth had fallen. Its defenses were no match for the overwhelming power of Velkera's forces. Humanity's mighty warships had been burned in space, their cities reduced to ruins. Billions had surrendered, and those who resisted had been executed without mercy. There was no escape, no hope, only submission. The prisoners, soldiers, leaders, and survivors stood in the middle of the throne room. Some looked defeated, others barely held their heads up. They had fought, but fighting had brought them nothing but chains. The queen sat on her massive throne, her golden armor shining under the dim light. Her black scaled tail curled around the armrest, her sharp claws tapped against the stone. Velkera's crimson eyes studied the humans with cold amusement. "Kneel," she commanded. The order was final. No one disobeyed her and lived. The humans hesitated, but they knew what would happen if they refused. One by one, they dropped to their knees, lowering their heads in submission. All except one. A single man remained standing. Daniel Reeve. The alien warlords shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other. The guards tightened their grips on their weapons, a human daring to defy the queen. It was suicide. Velkera's eyes narrowed. She leaned forward slightly, observing the man before her. He wasn't the biggest or strongest-looking human. His clothes were torn, his face bruised, but his eyes burned with defiance. "Kneel, human," she repeated, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. Daniel did not move. A cold silence fell over the hall. The warlords, who moments ago had been smirking, now watched with tense anticipation. No one had ever defied the queen like this and lived. Velkera rose from her throne. The sound of her armored boots echoed in the vast chamber as she stepped forward. She towered over the human, her presence radiating raw power. "You misunderstand," she said slowly. "This is not a request. It is an order. You will kneel or you will die." Daniel's lips curled into a small, almost mocking smile. "Then kill me," he said. His voice was calm, steady, without fear. The queen's eyes flashed with something dangerous. Amusement or anger. A nearby warlord hissed, "Foolish human, do you not value your life? Do you not understand who stands before you?" Daniel did not break eye contact with the queen. He was the last of his squad, the last of his unit, the last of those who had fought until the bitter end. If Earth had already fallen, if there was nothing left, then why should he kneel? "You may have conquered my planet, but you will never conquer me," Daniel said. Gasps spread through the hall. Some warlords bared their fangs, enraged by his disrespect. Others remained silent, waiting for the inevitable execution. Velkera stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, to everyone's shock, she laughed. It was a low, dangerous sound. "Interesting," she murmured. With a flick of her wrist, the guard stepped forward. "Break him," she ordered. Two massive alien warriors grabbed Daniel, dragging him down. They forced him to his knees, but he resisted, muscles straining, refusing to bend completely. One guard slammed his fist into Daniel's stomach, making him gasp for breath, but he still didn't fall. Another punched him across the face, blood spilling from his lips. The hall watched in silence. Most humans broke after the first strike. Daniel refused. The queen observed, curious now. This was no ordinary human. He should be afraid, begging for mercy, like all the others before him. Instead, he lifted his head, spat blood on the floor, and looked straight into her eyes. The queen's amusement faded. Her clawed hand extended, stopping the next punch. The guards immediately stepped back, confused but obedient. She walked toward Daniel, her shadow towering over him. "You are different," she said softly. Daniel, bruised and bleeding, grinned through the pain. "Glad you noticed," he muttered. The queen's eyes gleamed. "Very well," she said. "Let's see how long you last before you break." The warlords cheered. This human suffering would be entertaining. The other prisoners watched in horror, knowing what was coming. But Daniel, he only smirked. He wasn't going to break, no matter what she did. Not now. Not ever. The queen's amusement turns to rage. The grand hall of Queen Velkera was no longer filled with laughter or arrogance. The air was thick with tension. Warlords, nobles, and generals, all of them had expected the human to fall, to submit like every other species before the might of their queen. But Daniel Reeves still stood, his body battered, his lips cracked and bleeding, yet his spirit unbroken. The alien warriors that had beaten him looked at Velkera for further orders, their scaled hands stained with his blood, their muscles tight with anticipation. Yet the queen did not speak. Instead, she stared at him, her crimson eyes locked onto his, searching for something. A dangerous amusement. Velkera was a conqueror. She had ruled over 49 star systems, crushed hundreds of civilizations, and enslaved millions. Never before had a captive refused her command so boldly. There was no fear in Daniel's eyes, only something far more dangerous: defiance. A slow, eerie silence filled the chamber. The queen tilted her head slightly, as if considering something. The warlords around her began whispering among themselves. "Kill him already," one of them growled, his heavy armor clinking as he shifted impatiently. "He insults our queen." Another spat. "His death should be slow." A third, an old strategist, narrowed his eyes. Perhaps he could be used as an example. A slow, public breaking might make other humans surrender faster. Daniel heard it all. He didn't care. His focus remained on the queen. Velkera finally stepped forward, her armored boots echoing loudly as she descended from her throne. The guards stepped back immediately, giving her space. The queen stopped in front of Daniel, her sharp claws lifting his chin slightly, forcing him to look up. "Tell me, human," she said, her voice smooth but deadly. "Do you enjoy pain? Is this some pathetic attempt to appear stronger than you are?" Daniel didn't flinch. He grinned, despite the blood dripping from his mouth. "You can try to break me," he said, voice rough but unwavering. "But you'll fail." A sharp hiss filled the chamber. One of the nobles cursed in his native tongue, while others glared in outrage. No one spoke to the queen like that. Velkera's eye twitched, her claws tightening just a little against his jaw. Then she did something that sent a wave of unease through the hall. She laughed. A dark, velvety sound. Her laughter was not of mockery, nor of amusement. No, it was something else. It was intrigue. The command that shocked the warlords. She turned her back to him, facing her warlords. "This one is different," she mused, her long tail flicking behind her. It would be a waste to kill him now. The warlords froze. One of them, a massive reptilian warrior, stepped forward. "My queen," he said carefully, "he is just a human, a weak species, a lowly creature." The sharp, sudden crack of the queen's whip-like tail slamming into the stone floor cut him off instantly. Every warlord, every soldier, even the humans flinched at the sound. Velkera's expression darkened. "Are you questioning me?" she asked, her tone soft, but it carried the weight of 1,000 deaths. The reptilian warlord immediately lowered his head in submission. "No, my queen." The queen's gaze swept across the hall, daring anyone else to challenge her. No one did. Satisfied, she turned back to Daniel. "You say I cannot break you," she said, stepping closer. "Very well. Let's see how long that remains true." She snapped her fingers. 2 guards rushed forward, gripping Daniel's arms tightly. "You will not die today," Velkera declared. "Instead, you will entertain me." Daniel felt his body tense. Thrown into the arena. Moments later, Daniel was dragged through the palace, pulled down the cold, dark hallways of the royal fortress. The guards were rough, their clawed fingers digging into his arms, but Daniel never resisted. He didn't need to. He was already thinking, calculating, waiting. Finally, they stopped. The massive iron doors in front of them groaned as they opened. Blinding artificial sunlight flooded his vision. The roaring cheers of thousands of alien spectators filled the air. Daniel was shoved forward into a massive gladiator arena. His head snapped up as he saw the battlefield before him. Blood-stained sand, weapons littered across the ground, giant alien beasts snarling in the distance. Above, in the royal balcony, Velkera sat on her throne once again, looking down at him. Her crimson eyes gleamed with excitement. She smirked. "Fight, human," her voice echoed across the arena. "Let's see if you can survive." The first wave. A loud horn sounded. The gates on the other side of the arena slammed open, and 4 massive alien warriors stepped out. Each one was over 8 feet tall, their bodies covered in thick armor, their razor-sharp weapons glinting under the sunlight. The crowd cheered wildly, eager to see the human torn apart. Daniel wiped the blood from his mouth. He glanced up at Velkera, then back at his enemies. His fingers clenched into fists. They expected him to fall. They expected him to break. They were wrong. As the first warrior charged forward, Daniel moved first, faster than anyone expected. The battle had begun. The impossible escape begins. The roar of the crowd echoed through the massive gladiator arena, a deafening wave of hunger for blood and entertainment. Thousands of alien spectators sat in their high, shadowed seats, their glowing eyes locked onto the lone human standing in the sand. Above them all, seated in her royal balcony, Queen Velkera watched with an amused smirk. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She leaned forward slightly, her crimson gaze never leaving Daniel Reeve, the human who refused to kneel. "Let's see how long your defiance lasts, human," she murmured to herself. Then she lifted her hand and gave a simple final command. "Begin." The first kill. A thunderous horn blast shook the arena, marking the start of the fight. Daniel didn't hesitate. The 4 massive alien warriors that had stepped into the arena were not just random prisoners. No, they were hand-picked killers, veterans of war, monsters who had slaughtered entire species in Velkera's name. The first one, a hulking, 6-limbed beast covered in armored plates, charged forward with terrifying speed, its massive energy axe raised high. Daniel moved. He ducked just in time, the axe slamming into the sand where his head had been a second ago. The impact sent a shockwave of dust and debris into the air. Daniel grabbed a fallen sword from the ground, and with a fluid motion, sliced across the creature's exposed leg. A howl of pain erupted from its throat as it stumbled. The crowd gasped. No one expected a human to move like that. Velkera's smirk widened. "Interesting," she whispered, but there was no time to celebrate. The second warrior, a reptilian brute with razor-sharp claws, lunged from behind. Daniel twisted at the last second, feeling the wind of the creature's claws barely miss his spine. He reacted instinctively, driving his stolen sword straight through the enemy's chest. A choked gurgle, a heavy thud. The first kill. The crowd fell silent. Daniel wrenched the blade free, breathing heavily, adrenaline pumping through his veins. 2 enemies remained, and now they were angry. The queen's interest grows. Velkera leaned back into her throne, her interest shifting. She had expected Daniel to put up a fight. She had hoped he would, but this was beyond expectation. His movements, his instincts, his refusal to surrender even in a hopeless battle. It was unlike any human she had encountered. She had conquered thousands of species. None had fought like this. Her warlords noticed it too. "My queen," one of them muttered, his voice cautious. "This human, he is dangerous." She didn't respond. Her focus remained on Daniel. For the first time, in a long time, she was entertained. Turning the tide. Daniel was exhausted, but he couldn't stop. The third warrior, a towering brute with spiked fists, swung at him, aiming to crush him into the ground. Daniel sidestepped, barely avoiding instant death. Before the enemy could recover, he kicked sand into its face, momentarily blinding it. Then he grabbed a fallen spear and drove it straight through the warrior's exposed throat. Another one down. The final opponent, a massive wolf-like alien with glowing blue fangs, growled low, recognizing the human as a real threat now. It didn't charge recklessly like the others. It stalked him, circling, waiting. Daniel clenched his fists, knowing this one was different, smarter, and he was already at his limit. His breathing was ragged, blood dripped from a wound in his side. His muscles screamed in pain. He wouldn't last much longer, but he refused to kneel. The wolf struck first, a blur of motion, a flash of blue fangs. Daniel dodged, but not fast enough. Pain exploded across his shoulder as the creature's claws raked through his flesh. He hit the ground hard. The crowd exploded in cheers. The beast pounced, aiming to tear him apart. Daniel rolled at the last second, grabbing a nearby broken sword. As the beast's jaws snapped down toward him, he thrust the blade straight through its skull. A deep, sickening crack. The wolf's glowing eyes dimmed. Then it collapsed. The final enemy was dead, and Daniel was still standing. A silent, shocked arena. For the first time in history, a human had survived Velkera's arena. The crowd, once roaring for his death, now sat in stunned silence. Velkera, too, remained still for a long moment, staring at the bruised, bloodied human standing in the center of the battlefield. Then she did something that sent chills through her warlords. She smiled. "Fascinating," she murmured. A slow applause followed. The warlords gaped in disbelief. Was their queen, impressed by a human. "Bring him to me," Velkera commanded. "I wish to speak to him." The guards hesitated before moving, grabbing Daniel's arms. He didn't resist. Instead, he smirked up at the queen, despite the pain. Velkera noticed that smirk. Her fingers tightened on her throne. This human was more than just strong. He was dangerous, and she had just decided. He would not die today. No, she would keep him. For now, a deal with the devil. Daniel could barely stand. His body screamed with pain, his muscles burned, and his vision blurred at the edges. Every breath felt like a knife in his ribs, and his wounds bled freely onto the blood-soaked sand of the gladiator arena. Yet despite all of that, he was still alive. And more importantly, he had won. The alien crowd, which had once roared for his death, now sat in stunned silence. The warriors of Velkera, the conquerors of worlds, had just witnessed the impossible. A human, a species they had mocked, enslaved and broken, had just defeated 4 of their best gladiators. Alone, high above in her royal balcony, Queen Velkera sat on her massive throne, one leg crossed over the other, her sharp claws tapping against the stone armrest. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes burned with something dangerous. Amusement, curiosity, and something else, something even she didn't understand yet. "Bring him to me," she finally commanded. The warlords beside her stiffened, some glancing at each other in disbelief. "My queen," one of them dared to speak. "This human is—" Velkera turned her head slowly, her gaze landing on the unfortunate warlord. "Do you wish to challenge me on this?" she asked softly. The warlord's throat clicked as he swallowed hard. He immediately lowered his head. "No, my queen." Velkera smirked. "Good." Dragged before the queen. Daniel barely resisted as the guards grabbed his arms, hauling him up the steps toward the royal balcony. He was too exhausted to fight back, but his mind was still sharp. He wasn't a fool. Velkera wasn't keeping him alive out of kindness. She was testing him, and if he wasn't careful, he'd soon wish she had let him die. The guards shoved him forward until he was kneeling at the foot of her throne. "Kneel properly," one of them hissed, grabbing Daniel's shoulder and forcing him down. Daniel gritted his teeth but refused to let out any sound of pain. He looked up at Velkera, meeting her gaze without fear. Silence stretched between them. Then, to his surprise, she actually chuckled. "Still defiant," she mused, "even after everything." Daniel exhaled slowly, tasting blood in his mouth. He forced a mocking smirk onto his lips. "You're gonna have to do better than that." Velkera's eyes gleamed. "Oh, human," she purred, leaning forward slightly. "You haven't even begun to see what I can do." A slow shiver ran down Daniel's spine. Not from fear, but from something worse. Anticipation. The Queen's offer. Velkera studied him, her tail flicking lazily behind her. "You are an anomaly, human," she admitted. "Your species was meant to break, to submit. Yet you do neither." Daniel didn't reply. "I could have you executed right now," she continued, watching him closely. "And yet, I find myself reluctant." Daniel gave a bitter chuckle. "Lucky me." "Lucky indeed." She leaned back, her gaze turning sharp. "I have an offer for you." Daniel stilled. He had expected torture, imprisonment, a slow death. But an offer. That was new. "You fought well today," Velkera said, tilting her head. "And despite the odds, you survived. That alone proves you are worth more alive than dead." She tapped her claws against the stone armrest. "So here is my proposition, human. Serve me, and I will spare your life." Daniel's entire body tensed. Serve her? He'd rather die. But he didn't say that. He knew better than to refuse outright. Instead, he chose his words carefully. "Spare my life." "For what exactly?" he asked. Velkera smirked. "You will fight in my arena," she said simply. "As my champion. Prove yourself, and perhaps you will earn something more." Daniel clenched his jaw. "And if I refuse?" Velkera's smile didn't fade. "Then I will personally ensure your suffering is legendary." She rested her chin on her hand. "You have seen my empire, Daniel Reeve. You know what I am capable of. Do you truly think I am bluffing?" Daniel swallowed his rage. She wasn't bluffing, and he was in no position to call her bluff. His mind raced. If he refused, she would torture him, break him, and toss him aside like garbage. If he accepted, well, he would still be her prisoner, but at least he would be alive. Alive, and with time to plan. Daniel exhaled slowly. Then he made his choice. "Fine," he said. "I'll fight." The Queen's triumph. Velkera's smile widened. "Good," she said softly. She stood, stepping closer to him. The guards around him tensed as she lifted her clawed hand, but she did not strike him. Instead, she tilted his chin up, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You may believe this is your choice," she murmured, "but do not be mistaken, human. You belong to me now." Daniel's jaw tightened. Not forever, he told himself. Not forever. The Queen released him, turning away. "Take him to the royal chambers," she commanded. "Ensure he is well cared for." The guards bowed before dragging Daniel away. As he was pulled from the throne room, he felt Velkera's gaze on his back. She was watching him, studying him. And for the first time, Daniel realized something far more terrifying than death. The Queen wasn't just amused by him anymore. She was obsessed. And that meant things were about to get much worse. For both of them. The Queen's growing obsession. Daniel was no fool. The moment he agreed to fight, he knew he had only bought himself time. Time to plan. Time to understand his captor. Time to escape. But what he hadn't expected was this. He sat alone in the royal chambers, a place meant for nobility, not prisoners. The massive room was ornate and luxurious, filled with silken cushions, golden fixtures, and a view of the capital city below. A bath large enough to fit 5 people steamed in the corner. Exotic alien fruits were laid out on a tray beside his bed. It wasn't a prison. It was a gilded cage, and Daniel knew exactly why. The queen wasn't just keeping him alive. She was watching him, testing him, and worst of all, she was fascinated by him. The queen watches. Velkera observed from her throne room, watching the live holographic projection of Daniel in his chambers. He was interesting. Too interesting. His defiance had been expected at first. All dying species had their rebels, their heroes who believed resistance mattered. But what baffled her was how Daniel never lost that fire. Most prisoners submitted over time, no matter how proud they were, no matter how strong. Eventually, they all broke. But not him. Even alone, he was still calculating, thinking, resisting. She saw it in the way he paced the room, the way he studied the door, the way he examined every object, as if it were a potential weapon. He was planning something, and that excited her. One of her advisors, a warlord named Zothan, hesitated before speaking. "My queen," he said carefully, "your interest in this human is becoming noticeable." Velkera turned her head slightly, her crimson gaze unreadable. Zothan swallowed hard but continued. "You have executed warriors for far less disrespect than what this human has shown you. Yet he walks freely in your royal halls. The court is beginning to question your judgment." Velkera didn't move. Then, slowly, she smiled. "Let them question," she said. Zothan stiffened. "But my queen." Velkera rose from her throne, stepping down from the elevated platform. "Do you fear him, Zothan?" she asked softly. The warlord immediately lowered his head. "Of course not, my queen." Velkera smirked. "Then why do you worry?" She stepped past him, her armored heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "I have ruled for centuries. I have crushed empires. I do not make mistakes." She glanced back at the projection, watching as Daniel stood by the window, staring at the city below. "Let him plan," she whispered. "Let him resist." Her smile deepened. "Because the moment he thinks he has won." She turned away. "I will remind him who truly rules." A dangerous game. Daniel sat on the edge of the enormous bed, deep in thought. Every part of him wanted to rage, to fight back, to prove that he would never belong to this empire. But raw defiance wouldn't be enough. He needed a strategy. He had seen the city, the patrols, the guard rotations. He had mapped every exit in his head. But none of it would matter unless he found a real opportunity. The doors suddenly slid open, and 2 alien servants entered, carrying a tray of food. Daniel's jaw clenched. He had refused to eat before, but his body couldn't hold out forever. The food was placed before him. Some kind of roasted meat, along with strange fruits that smelled sweet but unfamiliar. The taller servant, a female with pale blue skin and large violet eyes, hesitated before speaking. "You should eat," she said softly. "The queen does not take well to disobedience." Daniel looked at her, then at the food. Then, without a word, he picked up the plate and carried it to the window. The servants exchanged glances. Daniel did not eat. Instead, he dropped the entire tray over the edge, letting it tumble down hundreds of feet to the streets below. A dead silence followed. The blue-skinned servant gasped in horror, stepping back. The other one visibly paled, looking toward the security cameras in the corner. Daniel turned toward them, his face calm. "Tell your queen," he said, "that I don't take orders." The queen's reaction. Velkera had been watching, and for the first time in a long time, she was genuinely surprised. Not because he had refused the food, but because he had made sure she saw it. One of the guards tensed, awaiting her command for execution. Instead, Velkera laughed. A low, velvety sound. Her warlords shifted uneasily. They had seen her laugh before, but not like this. Not with this strange, dangerous amusement. "Unbelievable," she murmured, shaking her head. She turned to one of her personal guards. "Bring him to me," she ordered. The guard bowed. "Shall we punish him, my queen?" Velkera smirked. "No," she said. "I wish to see what he does next." The queen's proposition. Daniel was dragged before Velkera once more, but this time she was not seated on her throne. She was standing, waiting for him, her golden armor reflecting the dim lighting of the grand hall. She studied him for a long moment. "You refuse to eat," she said. "Why?" Daniel met her gaze without hesitation. "Because I don't belong to you," he answered simply. Velkera's expression remained neutral. Then she stepped closer, her sharp claws gently trailing along his jawline. Daniel tensed but did not flinch. "You think you are still free," she mused, "that you can defy me forever." She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I admire your spirit, Daniel Reeve." Her fingers tightened against his jaw. "But admiration will not save you." Daniel's breathing was steady, his mind racing. He needed a way out, a distraction, anything. Velkera stepped back, her gaze calculating. "Very well," she said. "If you do not wish to eat like a warrior." She smiled coldly. "Then you will fight like one." A slow dread settled in Daniel's chest. "What does that mean?" he asked, voice low. Velkera turned away, her tail swishing behind her. "You will fight again," she said. "And this time, it will not be against prisoners." She looked over her shoulder, her crimson eyes gleaming. "This time, you will face my warlords." A heartbeat of silence. Daniel exhaled slowly. Then he smirked. "Good," he muttered. "I was getting bored anyway." Velkera chuckled. "You truly are fascinating," she whispered. And for the first time, Daniel realized the truth. This wasn't just about power anymore. The queen didn't just want to break him. She wanted to understand him. And that was far more dangerous. The final trial. The queen versus the human. The moment the announcement was made, the entire empire held its breath. No one had ever challenged the queen. No one had ever been given the chance. But now, for the first time in history, Queen Velkera herself would step into the arena, not to execute a prisoner, not to put on a show, but to fight one human. And the entire galaxy was watching. The Arena of Gods. The Grand Colosseum, known as the Arena of Gods, was older than the empire itself. It had witnessed the blood of thousands of warriors, seen the rise and fall of mighty champions. And now it would bear witness to something unthinkable. Daniel stood in the middle of the vast battlefield, his breathing calm but his heart pounding. Above him, hundreds of thousands of alien spectators filled the arena seats, whispering in disbelief. Every noble, every warlord, every commander in Velkera's empire had come to see this event. This wasn't just a fight. This was a message. The queen was about to prove her absolute rule. Or, Daniel was about to do the impossible. The queen descends. A hush fell over the arena as Velkera appeared. She stood at the highest balcony, her golden armor gleaming, her long black hair flowing behind her, and her crimson eyes locked onto Daniel. Then, without hesitation, she leaped. The entire stadium shook as she landed, the force of her descent cracking the stone beneath her feet. Dust rose around her, but she didn't move, standing tall as a goddess of war. The moment her boots touched the battlefield, the crowd erupted into deafening cheers. Daniel simply exhaled. He had faced death before. This was no different. Except, Velkera wasn't just any warrior. She was the best. And she had no intention of making this easy for him. The queen's warning. Velkera took a step forward, her golden spear resting on her shoulder. "I will give you one last chance, human," she said, her voice carrying across the Colosseum. She pointed her spear at him. "Kneel." The crowd hushed. Daniel looked at her. Then he smirked. "You already know the answer to that," he said. A flicker of amusement crossed Velkera's face. Then it was gone. "Very well," she murmured. And then she attacked. A fight unlike any other. Daniel barely dodged as Velkera's spear sliced through the air, moving faster than anything he had ever seen. A single misstep, and he would have been cut in half. He rolled, grabbed a fallen blade from the ground, and countered, but she was already gone. Too fast. Velkera struck again, this time from the left. Daniel barely managed to block, but the impact sent him skidding across the sand. His arms ached. She was strong, stronger than anything he had ever fought. But that didn't matter, because Daniel had never relied on strength. He had always relied on his mind, the unpredictable human. Velkera smirked as she watched him struggle. "Is this the limit of your defiance?" she teased, slowly circling him. Daniel wiped blood from his lip, his grin never fading. "That's cute," he said, shifting his stance. "You actually think you're winning?" Velkera raised an eyebrow. "Am I not?" Daniel suddenly charged. The queen didn't hesitate. She swung her spear. But this time, Daniel ducked under it at the last second and moved in. For the first time, Velkera's eyes widened as Daniel twisted his body, using her own momentum against her, and struck her. A clean hit to her ribs. The stadium gasped. The Queen of the Empire had just been hit by a human. And worst of all, she felt it. Velkera took a step back, her hand touching her armor where he had landed the blow. Silence. Then, she laughed. It wasn't an angry laugh. It wasn't even an amused one. It was genuine. "Unbelievable," she whispered, shaking her head. "You truly are something else, Daniel Reeve." Daniel rolled his shoulders, starting to regret this fight. Velkera grinned, not even a little. Then she attacked again. A battle of equals. This time, it was different. The fight escalated. Velkera no longer toyed with him. She came at him with deadly precision, her strikes meant to kill. And Daniel, he adapted. He dodged faster, moved sharper, fought with everything he had left. They clashed again and again, neither giving an inch. For the first time in history, the queen was not simply crushing her opponent. She was fighting a warrior, an equal. And she loved it. The moment that changed everything. The fight went on for minutes that felt like hours. Then, Velkera struck hard, her spear cutting just above Daniel's shoulder. Daniel twisted, countered, and, by some miracle, his blade slashed across her cheek. A thin line of crimson blood appeared. The crowd froze. The warlords gasped in horror. The queen stopped moving. Daniel stood there, panting, bloodied, exhausted. Velkera slowly reached up, touching the small wound on her cheek. And then, she smiled. Not just any smile. Something deeper. Something far more dangerous. She stepped forward. And to Daniel's utter shock, she dropped her spear. The audience went wild. Velkera ignored them. She looked at Daniel, something dark and undeniably fascinated burning in her eyes. "Enough," she murmured. Daniel frowned, breathing heavily. "What?" She took another step. "You win." The arena fell silent. Velkera tilted her head, studying him. "I wanted to see what you were truly made of," she said. "And now I have my answer." She smiled. "You are mine now." Daniel clenched his fists. "I don't belong to you." Velkera chuckled. "Not yet." She turned away, her tail swaying lazily behind her. "Take him to the palace," she commanded her guards. She glanced over her shoulder one last time, "and make sure he is treated properly." Daniel exhaled slowly, realizing the truth. This wasn't just a battle. This had been a test, and somehow, he had passed. A fate worse than death. Daniel had fought many battles in his life, wars on distant planets, insurgencies in collapsing cities. He had faced death countless times, stared it right in the eye, and laughed. But this was something far worse. He wasn't sure when it happened. Maybe it was when Velkera stepped into the arena herself, treating him as an equal. Maybe it was when she smirked at his defiance instead of punishing him. Maybe it was when she dropped her spear and simply declared him hers. He had expected death. Instead, he got something much more terrifying. Velkera hadn't just spared him. She had claimed him. And now he had to figure out what that meant. A gilded cage. The grand palace of Velkera was a place of nightmares and beauty. It was massive, built atop a mountain of black stone, its towers stretching high into the burning red skies of the Empire's capital world, a fortress of war, a kingdom of dominance. And now it was Daniel's new prison. The Queen had not thrown him into a dungeon. No, that would have been too easy. Instead, he was placed in royal quarters, a room larger than most battle cruisers, filled with lavish silks, strange glowing lanterns, and a view of the entire city. There were no bars, no chains, no visible guards. But Daniel knew better. This was a test, a trap. She wanted to see what he would do next, and that was what scared him the most. The Queen's first move. The doors to his chamber slid open. Daniel immediately tensed, but he didn't move from where he sat near the large window. Velkera stepped inside, her golden armor absent. Instead, she wore a long, dark robe, embroidered with silver designs that shimmered under the dim lighting. Her hair, usually tied back, was loose, cascading over her shoulders. She looked different, less like a conqueror, more like something else, something he didn't want to name. Daniel forced himself to stay still. She was playing a game. And if he wasn't careful, he'd lose. Velkera studied him for a long moment, then walked slowly toward the center of the room. "You haven't tried to escape," she noted. Daniel smirked. "Yet." Velkera's lips curled slightly. "You are learning." She turned her gaze toward the massive window, her eyes reflecting the glow of the distant city lights. "Do you know what the people are saying?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer. "They whisper about you, Daniel Reeve," she continued. "They call you the Unbroken One, the human who fought the Queen and lived. Some see you as a threat, others see you as a trophy." She finally turned to him. "But I see you as something more." Daniel clenched his fists. "I don't belong to you," he said. Velkera chuckled, stepping closer. "You still think this is about ownership?" she asked. She slowly leaned down until her face was inches from his. "This is about power." Daniel didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. This wasn't a war anymore. It was something far more dangerous, a new kind of battle. Velkera finally stepped back, turning away. "I have conquered countless worlds," she mused, "defeated thousands of warriors. None have ever stood against me the way you have." She slowly ran her fingers along the edge of the table, her voice low. "You interest me, Daniel Reeve." Daniel exhaled. "Glad to keep you entertained." Velkera's eyes flashed. "This is more than entertainment," she said. She turned to him fully. "I want to see what you become." Daniel froze. Velkera smirked. "Do you know why I let you live?" she asked, stepping closer once again. Daniel remained silent. She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you are the first being in centuries to make me feel something other than conquest." Daniel's breath hitched. She slowly tilted her head. "You hate me. You resist me. But tell me, human." Her gaze flickered with dark amusement. "If this is a prison, then why haven't you tried to run?" Daniel's jaw tightened. Because she was right. He should be running. He should be plotting his escape. But instead, he was standing here, matching her gaze, refusing to back down. And he didn't know why. A dangerous proposition. Velkera finally stepped back, her smirk never fading. "I will not force you to kneel, Daniel Reeve," she said. "You will come to that decision yourself." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Not in this lifetime." Velkera laughed softly. "We shall see." She turned toward the door, but paused before leaving. "Oh, and one more thing," she added without looking back. "You will no longer be fighting in the arena." Daniel frowned. Then what? Velkera finally glanced over her shoulder, her crimson eyes gleaming. "You will fight beside me." The words hit him like a weapon. The doors slid shut behind her, leaving Daniel alone in the silence. His mind raced. This wasn't just a power play anymore. This was something else, something he wasn't ready for. But one thing was clear. The war between them was far from over. And for the first time, Daniel wasn't sure who would win. The Queen's gamble, trust or betrayal. Daniel had survived the arena. He had defied the Queen's rule. He had refused to kneel. But now he faced a different kind of battlefield. One where the war wasn't fought with weapons, but with trust, deception, and power. Velkera had given him a choice, fight beside her, and he had no idea why. The mission that changed everything. A week had passed since the fight in the arena. Daniel was no longer treated as a prisoner. But he wasn't free either. He had been given new quarters, closer to the Queen's private wing. His weapons had been returned to him. He could walk the halls without chains. And then, one morning, the Queen herself came to him. "Get dressed," she commanded. "We are leaving." Daniel frowned. Leaving? Where? Velkera smirked. To war. A battlefield unlike any other. The war fleet of Velkera was legendary. It stretched for miles, eclipsing the stars. Daniel stood on the deck of the flagship, staring at the armada ahead. Thousands of warships. Millions of soldiers. But this wasn't a war against humans. It was against a rebellion. A faction that had turned against the Empire. One that saw Velkera's rule as a weakness. And now, she was about to crush them. Daniel turned to her. "So let me get this straight. You want me to help you fight your own people?" Velkera studied him, her expression unreadable. "Not my people," she corrected. "Traitors." Daniel scoffed. "And you trust me with this?" Velkera stepped closer, her voice low. "I trust you to survive." Daniel's jaw tightened. This was another test. She wanted to see what he would do. Would he fight? Would he run? Would he betray her? He had to play this carefully. For now, he would go along with it, but he would choose his moment. The battle that changed the galaxy. The battlefield was a graveyard of metal and fire. Explosions ripped through the cold void of space. Starships shattered. The screams of warriors echoed through the communication channels. Daniel fought alongside Velkera's forces, not because he was loyal, but because he needed to survive long enough to find an escape. He fought like a human. Fast, unpredictable, ruthless. And the rebels feared him. The unbroken one. The warrior who had survived the Queen herself. Velkera watched him from the command deck. She saw the way he moved, the way he thought, the way he adapted. And she felt something dangerous. Pride. For the first time, she wondered, had she underestimated him? The betrayal that almost worked. After the battle, Daniel saw his chance. He had secured a ship, a way off this cursed empire. All he had to do was take it. But just as he reached the airlock, she was there. Velkera stood in his way, arms crossed, her crimson eyes piercing through him. "You really thought I wouldn't see this coming?" she asked. Daniel clenched his fists. "I had to try." Velkera chuckled. "Good," she murmured. "I would have been disappointed if you hadn't." Then her smile faded. "But you are not leaving." Daniel braced himself. He expected punishment, death, torture. Instead, Velkera did something he never expected. She turned off the security alarms. And she stepped aside. "You want to leave," she whispered. "Then go." Daniel froze. This was a trick, a trap. But her expression was unreadable. She was letting him go. Or at least, she wanted him to believe she was. The warship was right there. Freedom was one step away. So why couldn't he move? The final choice, freedom or dominion. Daniel had spent his entire life fighting for freedom. But standing there, facing Velkera, he felt something far more dangerous than captivity. Doubt. If I leave now, he said slowly, you'll hunt me. Velkera smirked. Of course. She took a step closer. You will always be hunted, Daniel Reeve. Whether it is by me, my enemies, or your own fate. Her voice was soft now. But if you stay, then you decide what happens next. Daniel stared at her. He had spent so much time fighting her. But what if the real fight was with himself? What if he had already changed? What if he had already become something more? Velkera tilted her head. Make your choice, human. Daniel exhaled. Then, he stepped away from the ship and walked back toward her. Velkera's smile widened. You belong to me now, she whispered. Daniel smirked. Not yet. But as the doors to the warship closed behind him, he knew the truth. He had never truly been her prisoner, and she had never truly been his enemy. This was something else, something far worse, or maybe something far better. The war was over, but the game between them had only just begun. The end.